The Special Fathers Network is thrilled to be sponsored by Rubin Law, a multi-generational law firm dedicated exclusively to serving families raising children with special needs. It's not one thing they do, it's the only thing they do. To find out more, go to rubinlaw.com, RUBIN law.com, or call 847-279-7999 and mention the Special Fathers Network for a free consultation. 847-279-7999, Rubin Law.
You have to look on the bright side and make the best of it, and you can't really just dwell on the negative. That would be really overwhelming. So I guess even the way that we handled it with Ericka, I mean, we kept her involved with our life, traveling across the country, and I guess you just have to try to be optimistic. Even in Ericka's case, when there really wasn't a lot of hope, I mean, that was probably the hardest thing, is that you just knew how predictable it was all going to turn out, but you just tried to make the best of it.
That's Lon Haldeman, one of the most respected endurance bike riders of all time, and a mentor of sorts to our host, David Hirsch. Lon and his wife Susan, also a champion bike rider, have two children, Rebecca and Ericka, who sadly died just shy of her first birthday of infantile ALS. It's an incredibly interesting conversation, and it's happening now on this Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast. Here's our host, David Hirsch.
Hi, and thanks for listening to the Dad to Dad podcast, Fathers Mentoring Fathers of Children with Special Needs, presented by the Special Fathers Network.
The Special Fathers Network is a dad-to-dad mentoring program for fathers raising children with special needs. Through our personalized matching process, new fathers with special needs children connect with mentor fathers in a similar situation. It's a great way for dads to support dads. To find out more, go to 21stcenturydads.org.
And if you're a dad looking for help or would like to offer help, we'd be honored to have you join our closed Facebook group. Please go to facebook.com/groups and search Dad to Dad.
So let's saddle up and listen to this conversation between Lon Haldeman and David Hirsch.
I'm thrilled to be talking today with my good friend Lon Haldeman of Sharon, Wisconsin, who's the father of two, co-owner of Pack Tours, and one of the most well-respected endurance bike riders, aka ultracyclists of all time. For the record, I met Lon 5 years ago when I was preparing to do Dad's On a Ride 2015, a 2,300-plus mile, 21-day ride from Santa Monica to Chicago. I was very fortunate that he took me under his wing and helped prepare me for that challenge. Lon, thank you for taking the time to do a podcast interview for the Special Fathers Network.
Yes, looking forward to it.
You and your wife, Susan, have been married for 37 years and are the proud parents of two girls, Rebecca, 33, and her younger sister, Ericka, born in 1991, and who sadly died before her first birthday of infantile ALS. Let's start with some background. Where did you grow up? Tell me something about your family.
Well, going way back, my relatives originally came from Switzerland and Germany to the United States in the 1730s, settled in the Pennsylvania region. They were farmers. I'm not sure why they got run out of town, but probably it was some kind of religious persecution going on at the time, and that's why they came. And they were farmers, and they settled in that region of New York, Pennsylvania, and then they eventually migrated into northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, sometime in the 1840s, homesteaded several farms in the state line area, and 80-acre parcels, and I'm not sure the details what the homesteading involved, but I think if you settled it, you got to keep it or something after 10 years. So I've been in the northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin area for a long time. So I grew up in Harvard, Illinois. I went to high school there. My parents went to high school there. They met in high school. Both families, the Haldeman side and my mom's side, the Hauver side, they've been in the whole region for a long time. So after high school, Susan and I got married in 1983. We didn't even have a house for 4 years or so. We just traveled around the country riding bikes. But then we decided to settle down. We found a parcel of land on the Wisconsin side of the Illinois border really only 10 miles from Harvard. And so that's where we currently live. And we've been here now for 28 years almost.
Okay. So there's some really long-term roots if your family dates back to the 1700s as far as immigrating to the U.S. And I'm sort of curious to know, what did your dad do for a living?
My dad, well, he was in the Korean War. Actually, I think he dabbled working at the Chemung, Illinois milk factory, Dean's Milk Factory, for a while. Then he went into service for 3 or 4 years, came back, was able to pick up his old job, and then he worked there for 40 years.
Oh, wow.
So he was at the factory a long time. And my grandfather had worked at that as a maintenance fellow before my dad even started there. And so then my grandpa probably didn't even start there until he was 40 years old, until he was 65-ish, his retirement age.
I'm sort of curious to know, how would you describe your relationship with your dad?
Great. I mean, he didn't have as many opportunities back then, didn't have really the chance to go to college. That wasn't even talked about back in 1949. When he graduated high school, going to college wasn't even something he thought about. So his big opportunity was to go in the Marines. And so he was a diehard Marine, his whole life. And so anyway, I had a really good relationship with him. I mean, as far as encouraging us to do sports, things like that. Even as a 6th grader, 7th grader, when our games started at 4 o'clock after school, he'd get off work at 3:30 and, have to drive 20 miles to get to a basketball game or something that started at 4 o'clock. And he and my mom never missed a game in all those years. And my dad, I mean, that was traditional, is, to go out and play catch, every day after school. He always had time for us. So we really had a good relationship.
Well, thanks for sharing. If I had to summarize, he was very present in your life, in your brother's lives. And I'm wondering, when you think about your dad, is there any lesson that comes to mind or something you always think about?
Well, of course, family always came first. And it always wasn't, about him. He always put us first. And even later on in life, after I started cycling, and we kind of got into this long distance cycling almost together, because without his support, there's really no way I could have pulled that off. I mean, doing what we were doing, these cross-country races, this is kind of back in the pioneering days, and everybody thought you were really crazy if you were going to go out and ride 200 miles a day, 300 miles a day, 400 miles a day, across the state, all night rides, 3-day 1,000-mile rides. It was a gradual progression for me as a cyclist over probably a 5-year period, and also for my mom and dad, as a support crew, learning how to do it. So everything that we were learning together. And as I became more well-known, and I was his son, but I mean, it always said, Lon's dad. He referred to him, everybody knew him as Lon's dad. So that's how he referred to himself.
Okay. Any other father figures when you were growing up, in addition to your dad and your grandpas?
Well, I guess the football coaches, basketball coaches, the sports was a big part of our lives through high school for sure. I was all state in football as a quarterback kind of thing, but there was really no future in that, and I understood that. My heart wasn't into it as much as cycling at that time. And I said, well, if I'm going to get a chance to do something, I'd rather do cycling. So that's kind of where I really had to make the decision, because people said, oh, I'm blowing a big opportunity to go play college football. And I said, yeah, but I might get an education out of it, but I don't think I really going to enjoy it, and I'd rather do cycling, which again was, at that time, was a real dead end. Nobody could understand why you would even want to be a cyclist. But anyway, that's where my enthusiasm and my heart was, and so that's why we pursued, cycling. And a lot of it was just for fun, with no long-term plans or anything.
Well, I've been reflecting a little bit about your background, your sort of German background. and the discipline that you have and the focus, the fact that your dad was a Marine, takes a certain amount of discipline to be a Marine, and typically Marines are known as pretty regimented people, right, as far as their parenting is concerned. And I'm wondering, where is it that you've developed the focus that you have? Because it's taken a lot of dedication to do some of the things you've done. Is there something in your background or something you would attribute that to?
I don't know. I know my parents always said I was just really stubborn. I don't know if that meant it was in a good way or a bad way, but they said I was really hard-headed and really stubborn. And I guess in some ways that could be related maybe to perseverance. To go shovel the driveway with snow, I would go out there and I would make sure I finished the whole job, even though I knew it was going to snow again in an hour. I still had to finish it. And then 2 hours later, I'd go out and do it again. So my parents said I always had that attitude to start a job, finish a job type of thing.
Okay.
And sometimes when, I told something wasn't possible, I was like, well, let's figure out a way to do it. And so maybe there was that part of it also that was beneficial in later years when it came time to do these cross-country rides, and people said, oh, there's just no practical way to pull it off, and we'd figure out a way to do it. So I think probably as a kid, that was probably a benefit. I was pretty much a loner type of a kid too. I played with my Lincoln Logs and my blocks alone by myself and try to use up every single Lincoln Log and make a house. And I would always be just doing stuff like that. From start to finish, I'd always have to try to complete the job.
Okay. It sounds like it's part of your DNA then. So I'm thinking about your education, and I think it would be accurate to say that you graduated from Harvard and that you were a Rhodes Scholar.
Yeah, well, that's when I started dating my wife. That's what she told her parents, that she was dating a man from Harvard. Try to butter him up a little bit.
Okay.
And then it's small print. She'd have to say, but that's Harvard, Illinois High School.
And the Rhodes Scholar comes from the fact that you've covered a lot of miles along the way.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I did a little homework. I've known a lot about this, but just for our listeners' benefit, so they don't think I was just blowing smoke about your credentials. I think it goes back to 1979. The first big event, if I can call it that, was this Wisconsin end-to-end from north to south. And you rode over 400 miles, 407 miles in 23 hours, 7 minutes. And then a couple years later, you went from New York to Santa Monica in 12 days and 18 hours, rested for a little bit, and then you rode back to New York again in just under 11 days, which reminds me of like Forrest Gump. When Forrest Gump goes across the country, turns around, and he just starts running back again. So you predated Forrest Gump. Mm-hmm. And then you did some track work, if I remember. It was in Northbrook, Illinois in 1981, and you rode 12 hours, 264 miles, and then over the next 12 hours in total, 24 hours, 454 miles, which sounds superhuman. And then in 1982, if I've got my years right, was the Great American Bike Race, which is the predecessor to what we know today as RAM. And that was a 9-day, 20-hour, 2,976-mile event. So you literally rode like 300 miles a day. And one of the interesting things that I learned when I was looking this up was that there was a fellow by the name of Thomas Stevens, and this goes back to 1884, and he was the first person apparently to cross the country by bike, and it took him 103 days, that it was like the 4-minute mile, and that nobody would ever be able to do that. And then once you were able to do that, it seemed like others sort of followed behind you. And then, not to give you all the credit, but Susan, your wife, is a very, very accomplished rider in her own right. And my recollection was the following year in 1983, you and Susan did a tandem bike ride, and you crossed the country in 10 days and 20 hours, which is a pretty amazing accomplishment. Yeah,
but you're skipping a year in there. 1982, before I did the Great American Bike Race, Susan actually crossed the country in 11 days, 16 hours, which at that time, the women's record had just been set a few months earlier at 14 days, and which was considered the all-time women's record because nobody had done it as a woman in less than 20 days. So this woman set it in 14 days, and Susan came along a month later and did it in 11 days, 16 hours.
Wow.
And that was kind of a predecessor to a lot of things, too, because she did the last 600 miles nonstop, basically from Columbus, Ohio, on to New York City. And that was done in late June, early July. And then I did the Great American Bike Race in early August, a month later. And having seen Susan do that last 600 miles nonstop at the end of a transcontinental, that's what I did at the start of that transcontinental, which kind of set a whole new precedent of riding 600 miles nonstop right at the start of a race. And I basically ended up with about a 6-8 hour lead over the other riders because they all went to sleep because they thought that's what you needed to do. Anyway, so Susan, had done something too that kind of inspired and changed the sport really for what she did.
Well, thanks for mentioning that. And were you married at that time, or I guess that predates your marriage, right?
Right.
Because you weren't married until 83.
We had done the double transcontinental. She was on the crew in 81. She did her record attempt in, say, June, July of 82. Then I did the Great American Bike Race in August. Then we got married in May of 83, and then we did the tandem record together from Santa Monica to New York City in 10 days, 20 hours. Then I did Race Across America again a month after that, and then we were basically doing Race Across America every year for the next dozen years.
Well, you've got some amazing U.S. credentials, but I know that you didn't limit yourself to riding in the U.S. You both have some pretty astounding records. One was Susan's in 1983, if the information is correct, 750 miles, the Paris, and a record 54 hours. So you were bike riding over there in France as well.
Yeah, well, in the Paris event, it's, from Paris out to the Atlantic Ocean and back is what it is. And it's been going on for now since the 1890s for over 100 years. And they only do it every 4 years. So that woman's record had stood at around 57 hours for quite a while, since I don't know when it was set, maybe in the 1950s or something. So anyway, Susan came along and broke that record in 1983. Yeah, that was a good accomplishment. I think it's been broken since, and I think there's been a few women since Susan did it almost 40 years ago, I guess, 38 years ago.
Yeah, pretty amazing to think of all the time that's transpired. The technology, has changed a lot. The understanding about nutrition and hydration and things. An amazing accomplishment on both your behalves. I think you still have the mixed tandem record, don't you? The one that you set in 1986, the two of you, 9 days, 20 hours.
Yes, and that was in April, which is really early to be doing a cross-country ride. And we really didn't have that great of a training season earlier than that. It just rained, it was cold, whatever, and even we went to Texas to try to train in January, and it was rainy and cold. But we knew we had a good crew, we had our bikes, we had everything ready, so we did it. And freezing temperatures, water bottles freezing in the middle of the night, riding in snowmobile mittens, bundled up all the time. The only benefit is we didn't have to deal with any heat stroke in the desert. And, we finished 9 days, 20 hours. We're thinking, oh, gee, we should have, broken 9 days. We were about 20 hours off our pace. But as it turns out, it's been a long time, 35 years, and nobody's really come that close to that record. A lot of really strong men-women tandem teams have tried it, and they really find out after about 3 days it's really not any fun anymore. The sore rear ends start to settle in and all the other problems. And that's what people don't really understand about a tandem is that it really beats you up. And people say, oh, a tandem should be faster, it should be easier and everything else. And it really isn't, because you're dealing with two people's problems and you're only going to be as fast as the weakest rider when their knee gives out and they've got saddle sores and they're sick and they're, off the bike with nausea and things like that. So that's why the tandem records are typically slower than the solo bikes. So when Susan and I set that record, we weren't that impressed with it, but it's really stood the test of time because there's probably a tandem couple in the race across America who tries it every few years. So there's maybe been 30 attempts on that record, and nobody's been below, 10 and a half days. I don't even know what the existing record is now, but there's nothing below 10 days.
Yeah, well, it is amazing that it's been well over 30 years since these records had been made and not broken. So anyway, I just wanted to emphasize the fact that when I say you're one of the most well-respected endurance bike riders of all time, that's just proof of that. So I'm bragging on you a little bit, so thanks. So it was about that same time in the mid-1980s that you and Susan started Pack Tours. So briefly, what is Pack Tours and what does it evolve to be?
Well, Pack Tour stands for Pacific Atlantic Cycling Tour. And we had this bright idea that if we could race across the country at 300 miles a day, we could do a fun tour at 200 miles a day and support people. And that's what our first cross-country trip was, 200 miles a day. Well, as it turns out, it was basically race across America with a sleep break at the Holiday Inn. So you still rode till dark and got up till sunrise and try to, knock off 200 miles in daylight hours. So that's pretty intense, after you've done it. The next year we said, no, we can't do this. We got to drop it down to 160 miles a day, which we did. And even that was hard. And then we said, no, let's drop it down to 135 a day. So these cross-country rides, instead of being 15 days, were 19 days, were 22 days. And then eventually in the mid-90s or so, we had to really concentrate it on the business. That became our real priority, is to run Pack Tour as a touring organization, and we actually try to stay in business, not just do it as a training ride.
Yeah, well, it's a testimony to the experience that you create for people, that they want to come back and do it again and again and again. So thanks for sharing. So let's switch gears and talk about special needs, first on a personal level and then beyond. So I'm sort of curious to know, before Ericka was born, did you or Susan have any experience with special needs?
No, not really. Nobody really in our family had any special needs or any kind of disabilities and things like that. So we didn't know anything at all about that. And back then, the genetic testing wasn't maybe as good as it is now. I suppose you could probably almost do some predictions, but we had no idea that, when Ericka would be born, that she would have this Wernig-Hoffman syndrome, which is like an infantile Lou Gehrig's disease. And they said, well, it's genetic. So, we were really shocked and surprised that, we'd have a daughter that had that kind of a disability.
How did the diagnosis come about?
Well, when Ericka was born, as a baby, she was rated in the hospital as perfect. She was kicking and, crying and everything was fine. And then after about 2 months, she really wasn't crying that much. And people said, oh, what a nice baby. She's so quiet. She's so peaceful. And then because she was our second kid, Rebecca had been, was 3 years older. But I remember Rebecca was, I'd hold her and she was squirming and, we'd watch the fireworks. Even when she was sleeping as a baby, she'd flinch and react. When the fireworks, she'd heard the big booms and stuff. And Ericka wouldn't do that. She wasn't responsive. And then they said, she just doesn't feel like she's kicking and crawling and has any desire to roll over and any of that. We went to Milwaukee and we did some at a children's hospital, and they did some testing. And then eventually, I think they did a nerve biopsy or something is how they actually have to do it. They take a nerve out of the leg or something. And then they said, and I remember the doctor was a friend of ours, and he comes in the room and he goes, this is not good. She's got Wernicke-Hoffmann disease. We're 90% sure of that. And it's like, well, okay, so what's the big deal with that? And they go, well, it's Lou Gehrig's disease, and it's 100% fatal. And we're like, okay, what does that mean? And they're like, well, Lou Gehrig, some strong, strapping athlete, it might, you might have 3, 5, 10 years of gradual decline. But with a baby, they're not that strong to start with. And they said, it's probably going to take 10 months. She's going to lose 10% every month over the next year. And, that was getting hit by a ton of bricks when we got that diagnosis. And the thing is, the doctor was right. We could tell month by month that she was losing a little bit. First of all, it's the kicking and the moving the arms and stuff. And then it becomes, even swallowing. She ended up, we had a feeding tube put in. And then, the next step would be all the other involuntary muscles, respiration and stuff like that. And, at that point, we had made a decision, no, we're not going to prolong this anymore. So we basically made her as comfortable as possible. But she had a very active life. She was with us on bike tours. I made her a special cradle, wooden cradle, because she couldn't sit in a car seat because she couldn't, sit up that well. But she had a cradle that she'd lay down in, put a strapper in the seatbelt and stuff. And she did the Mexico to Canada trip with us. And at every rest stop, people would get out and riders would carry her around and everybody's holding her. And so we tried to keep her involved as much as possible. So she did a Mexico to Canada trip in June and then the race across America a month later and across the country. So she was with us, 100% of the time, even though, she wasn't that healthy. And then finally it was, I remember February 15th of the next winter, I was holding her, and she started having these spells where you could just tell her breathing wasn't good, and she starts turning purple. And we had already done, life-saving measures on her many times because she was just losing it, and she basically went to sleep as I was holding her, and I was like, and we said, well, enough's enough. She's already suffered enough. So it was a very traumatic experience for me and our families, and it takes a long time to get over that. But eventually, we'll learn to deal with it as a family and personally. So anytime anybody's kid's kicking and screaming in a restaurant or something, I'm like, that's much better to have a kid that's kicking and screaming, because you don't want the alternative. So.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing. I'm just saddened as you recall the story, but that was the destiny, right? And you can't change that, but you somehow have to figure out how to move on, and maybe it helps, like you were saying, put things in perspective. So when you see a kid that's acting up or who's kicking and screaming, if you will, not everybody has the perspective that you and Susan or your family would, and the appreciation for, that's not the worst thing that could happen. So let's talk about some of the work that you and Susan have done over the decades. I know that in the past, as we were getting to know each other, and the very first ride that we went on together was a memorable experience for me. It was, I think, a 200-kilometer, 125-mile ride, and I had never ridden that far before. I don't know that I would have mentioned that to you beforehand, but I remember you inviting me to do this brevet with you and Rebecca, and you said, we're going to be doing this, the next week or so. This is where we're meeting, and if that date works out for you, it'd be great if you could join us. So I thought, well, it's sort of put up or shut up time for me. If I'm serious about riding 100-plus miles a day for 21 days in a row, I better kick myself into gear. I know that when we were on that first long-distance ride together, we were talking about a number of things that are really close to your heart, which are the burn camps and the work that you've been doing in Peru and then Ghana. So I'm wondering if you can reflect on each of those and share with our listeners what that's about.
Well, and I guess that in some ways it relates back to what I just mentioned about how things happen for a reason, and there is a higher purpose of how things tend to fall into place. And in 2009, we had a really bad house fire. We had built this house here, 4,000 square feet, 3 stories, whatever, tons of custom woodwork and everything that I had made inside the house. And we had a fire, total loss, although, the frame's still there. And so the lady that came in with the cleanup crew, and I got to know her over a period of a month, the Paul Davis Restoration Company was supporting a burn camp for Wisconsin kids. And the definition of a burn camp kid is they had to have been hospitalized for burn injuries. And I said, oh, yeah, what's that about? And they said, oh, they get together and they go swimming, canoeing and things. And I said, oh, would they like to go on a bike ride? And she said, oh, yeah, probably. And so I went with them with a bunch of donated bikes I had, and we got it had to be teenage kids, so it was like age 13 through 17. A lot of these, they knew how to ride a bike, but their idea of going on a bike ride was, 4 blocks to school. So we got them, got them a bike, and we're going to ride across Wisconsin from across to Milwaukee, in about 6 days, 40 miles a day. And that was, they might have well told them we were riding to the moon. They had no comprehension of that. So we're on the bike trails the first few days doing 25 miles one day, 35 miles the next. Eventually we're doing 50 miles. And at that age, the kids develop really fast and turned into really good riders. And so by the end of the ride, they're doing 60 miles and thinking they're invincible. So they had these T-shirts made, Biked Across Wisconsin and stuff, and they went back to school, and they were just bragging rights that they had done this ride. And so the next year, burn camp, we're going to do it again. And I said, you really want to do this? Because it really only was limited to about 10 kids. And they said, those 10 kids, they were bursting with confidence. We got to do it again. So we did it for like 5 years. So, that was really neat to see that transformation from, a kid who, barely could ride a mile to all of a sudden is riding 50, 60 miles. And the other kids at school really respected them for, what they were able to do. And then other projects, though, that developed, I was down in Peru on a trip with my dad, the typical touristy kind of thing you do on the Amazon. And then I ended up down there in the city of Iquitos, which is 400,000 people, but it's in the middle of the jungle, 400 miles in every direction. There is nothing. This is like no man's land. So anyway, we got, I was hanging out and I knew some people in the back neighborhoods, and this is tar paper hut neighborhoods. But they said, really what we need is a school. And I said, oh, okay. So it's kind of like Sidney Poitier and Lilies of the Field, the nuns say, oh, why don't you build us a school, build us a church. And so that's kind of what it was. So I went back home, we raised maybe, and I asked them how much is the school going to cost. They said, oh, $10,000. Well, it turned out it was more like $25,000 by the time we outfitted it. But we had, through the PAC2 organization, we had a lot of good donations, built a school, and then we started doing these other projects too. Some of the projects were actually really easy. There's at the time there was a lot of street kids, kind of homeless kids that lived there, and we would take them on a birthday party. We'd go to a restaurant, put this big meal together for them, and everybody got a new change of clothes, shoes, shorts, T-shirts, flip-flop sandals, all kinds of stuff. And what I remember most is that, we'd have like 40 kids come to this big party, and we'd give them this dinner, and they wouldn't eat it. They would take a few bites, and then they'd want a plastic bag to take it home because they knew they might not get anything else to eat for several days. And then eventually we built other schools. So that's what we've been doing in Peru, and that's been going on since 20 years.
Well, it's very amazing, and that you're doing this work not only locally with the burn camps, but down in Peru. And then more recently, you and Susan have created this Million Miles for ALS with the goal of raising $100,000 over the 4 years. So what is that?
Well, a couple things. PAC Tour, we've been doing it now for close to 40 years. All of our events every year, the riders accumulate about 250,000 miles. And we said, okay, if we have everybody contribute 10 cents a mile, that's $25,000. So if we do that for 4 years, that's $100,000, and 250,000 miles a year times 4, that's 1 million miles. So that's how we started this Million Miles for ALS to raise $100,000.
Excellent. Well, it's an ambitious goal. It sounds very doable when you break it up, the way you did, thinking that, on an average year, your customers, your clientele will ride 250,000 miles cumulatively. And if everybody puts a small amount in, just 10 cents a mile, it's $25,000 a year and $100,000 over 4 years. So it seems very achievable. So anything we can do to help support that or spread the message is very worthwhile. So I'm thinking about advice, and I'm wondering, thinking back to special needs, if there's any advice that you can offer a young dad who finds himself in a similar situation to your own, with a child that's born with, something that might be chronic or something that might be life-threatening, terminal. What advice would you offer?
Well, that's a heavy question. I guess you've got to stay optimistic about it, because it can, as you know, with your association, I've talked to so many fathers that have dealt with their problems. You have to look on the bright side and make the best of it, and you can't really just dwell on the negative. That would be really overwhelming. So I guess even the way that we handled it with Ericka, we kept her involved with our life, with traveling across the country and everything. We tried to keep everything as normal as practical for our family, and also show her a good life. And I guess you just have to try to be optimistic, and even in Ericka's case, when there really wasn't a lot of hope. That was probably the hardest thing, is that you just knew how predictable it was all going to turn out, but you just tried to make the best of it. And so I think that's what got us through it.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing. Let's give a special shout out to our mutual friend, Bob Olson, owner of Wheelworks in Crystal Lake, Illinois, for helping introduce us more than 5 years ago.
Yeah, Bob does a great job there at his shop.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Well, I think with your network is really important that fathers have an outlet and a way of gathering. So I think that's really important, because just so you know that other people have similar problems. I think sometimes you start to feel really isolated when you're just home dealing with a child that's got problems. That can be so overwhelming, and that you really don't understand that it could be happening thousands of times with other people. And to get those people together as a network, I think is really important. And I think that's why your organization is so beneficial to everybody.
Well, thank you. So if somebody wants to learn more about PAC Tours, Infantile ALS, make a donation to the Million Miles for ALS campaign, or to contact you, what's the best way to do that?
Well, our website is pactour.com, PACTOUR.com. There's no S on PAC Tour. So if you search that, pactour.com, and I believe on the homepage right now, we're in the process of redoing it because of our tour schedule coming up for next year. But there should be a link in the lower right-hand corner. I believe it says ALS, Million Miles for ALS. And you can go on that, and that basically then links you to the Wisconsin ALS donation page. And there's some more information about us and about Ericka and things and just what our history is. So that's the best way to track us down. And then there's, I believe, our email addresses are on there also, and our phone number. So if anybody ever wants to try to reach us in person, we talk to people all the time, call us. So we're very available if somebody wants to chat.
Well, we'll make sure that gets into the show notes so it'll be as easy as possible for people to follow up. Lon, thank you for taking the time and many insights. As a reminder, Lon is just one of the dads who's part of the Special Fathers Network, a mentoring program for fathers raising a child with special needs. If you'd like to be a mentor father or are seeking advice from a mentor father with a similar situation to your own, please go to 21stCenturyDads.org. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of the Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. As you probably know, the 21st Century Dads Foundation is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization, which means we need your help to keep our content free to all concerned. Would you please consider making a tax-deductible donation? I would really appreciate your support. Would you also please share the podcast and post a review on iTunes to help us build our audience? Also, remember to subscribe so you'll get a reminder when each new episode is produced. Lon, thanks again.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to the Dad to Dad podcast, presented by the Special Fathers Network. The Special Fathers Network is a dad-to-dad mentoring program for fathers raising children with special needs. Through our personalized matching process, new fathers with special needs children connect with mentor fathers in a similar situation. It's a great way for fathers to support fathers. Go to 21stCenturyDads.org. That's 21stCenturyDads.org.
And if you're a dad looking for help or would like to offer help, we would be honored to have you join our closed Facebook group. Please go to facebook.com/groups and search Dad to Dad. Also, please be sure to register for the Special Fathers Network bi-weekly Zoom calls held on the first and third Tuesdays of every month. Lastly, we're always looking to share interesting stories. If you'd like to share your story or know of a compelling story, please send an email to david@21stCenturyDads.org.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen. The Dad to Dad podcast was produced by Couch Audio for the Special Fathers Network. Thanks again to Reuben Law for supporting the Dad to Dad podcast. Call Reuben Law at 847-279-7999 and mention the Special Fathers Network for a free consultation. 847-279-7999.